So welcome. I'm James Surowiecki. I am a editor at the Yale Review. I also teach in the English department, and I'm here today with Rana Dasgupta, who is, as you know, one of the new Windham-Campbell Fellows. Just a short bio, if that's okay, Rana. Rana has lived in the United States, India, and currently lives in France. You also lived in the UK, right? You were born in the UK.
I grew up in the UK, yeah.
Yeah, and he began actually as a novelist. So his first two books include, the first was a book called Tokyo Cancelled, which is described here as a collection of contemporary folk tales. Yeah. And then a novel called Solo, which won the Commonwealth Writers' Prize in 2010. But then in 2014, he published his first nonfiction book, Capital, The Eruption of Delhi, an exhilarating blend of literary reportage and intimate oral history, which I started to read last night, and it's really, really fascinating book. That won 2 awards and features, it's just a really, really interesting portrait of the city. And over the ensuing decade, his work has become ever more engaged with the grand forces acting on people in our era of globalization. And that's really what his new book, After Nations, which is what we're going to be talking about today, it will be coming out in, when, February?
In March in the US.
In March in the US. A really fascinating book, as you will hear, which explores the dissipation of or decline of the powers of the nation state and seeks ways for us to navigate the resulting confusion. Rana and I worked together on a piece of his for the new issue of the Yale Review, which I highly recommend, which is not quite an excerpt, but sort of a kind of a takeoff on the book.
An outgrowth.
Exactly, yeah. Exactly. And so today we are going to talk about After Nations, globalization, the nation state, and what the future looks like. We'll see. But let's start kind of at the beginning of your career. And so one of the fascinating things is, as you and I talked about yesterday, is that you begin as a novelist, as a storyteller, writing stories and then writing a novel. And then over the last 15 years have shifted into doing nonfiction, but not just nonfiction. After Nations is this very big book, there are elements of it that sort of remind me of like Ferdinand Braudel or something, you know, this kind of big synoptic history, very strong analytical focus, and then this like very interesting vision of the future. How did that evolution take place, and why did it take place?
Well, first of all, thank you for coming. You are the first audience to whom I've addressed any comments about this book. As the writers in the audience will know, speaking for the first time about a book is terrifying because you know how to write it, but you don't know how to speak about it yet. So I'm learning on the spot. Yes, it's a very different book from anything I've written before. I was on this stage 2 hours ago, and I said some of these things, so apologies to anyone who was here. I think my background is in several countries. I have an Indian father and a British mother. I've lived in several countries. And I think that a lot of my work has been about not just globalization, though that's the kind of a label, but the feeling that we are all of us connected as human beings, but also politically and economically. And that some of the focuses on very parochial or local issues can blind us to the things that we all share together and that should concern all of us as a species. So I think this book came out of several kind of more proximate causes. One I think is that at the time that I began writing it, which was after Donald Trump's first election here in the US, just after the great shock of Brexit in the UK, 2 years into Modi's election in India, where I was also spending a lot of time, amid the sort of greater and greater successes of the national rally, Marine Le Pen's party in France, where I was also spending a lot of time, it began to feel to me that there was a sort of convergence of concerns in different countries. and that it was natural in all those countries to look at what were the national reasons for these things happening. But as I moved between these countries, I began to feel that there might be something systemic. You know, why was it that these things were happening at the same time? Was it just a coincidence? Or were we at a phase in the history of the nation state which opened it up to these kinds of things? And I wanted to know what might be those systemic links, and it arose out of that. And I think, you know, to address the other part of your question, I mean, as a writer, this is simply another act of storytelling. I feel like some of the stories that we tell ourselves, for instance, the story that the nation state is the last stage in our political evolution, and that nothing ever is going to happen again, that's a very implausible story. It's never happened in the history of humanity that a kind of political form has lasted forever. So I think as a storyteller, I sort of react badly to bad stories. I want to improve them and write stories that are truer and more useful. And so this book is an attempt to write a story of the nation state that helps us better understand and navigate some of the things that are happening.
Okay. So even though your book, or I shouldn't say perhaps not even, but while your book is about globalization, what's interesting is that a lot of it is about nation states and about this idea of the nation state, right? And you write at one point, the nation state has consumed the past, by which I think you're talking about this idea that it sort of presents itself as transhistorical and universal and has always been. But then you say it has also consumed our hearts in the sense of we construct our identity in terms of nations and all. But the general argument of the book is that the nation state is, however we want to call it, in a decline, that the nation state is losing, if not exactly its power, it's losing to some degree its, maybe almost its reason to be in some ways. Why is this happening, and what are the consequences of it?
So I think it's important to define a few terms while we're having this conversation. So I think in the interest of sort of better stories, I think, first of all, the nation state, well, it's quite young. It's very volatile. And it shows none of the stability of some of the great empires, 1,000-year-long empires.
Can I say that? And that's something I don't think we think of the nation state as quite stable, but we don't conceive of it in those terms, I think.
Yeah, well, I think it not here, but there are nation states which in the last few years have basically ceased to exist as sort of viable forms of, they don't have a monopoly of management of a territory. But I think the other really crucial thing to point out about the nation state is it is not a set of isolated units, it is a unified system. And that system is, at this point in time, it is the other face of the capitalist system. Now, that is what has happened since the 1980s. I think in the period before then, there were attempts to create nation states which resisted capitalism or were closed to capitalism. But since the 1980s, we have a unified system that basically regulates and imposes the sort of property rights and things like this and the contract law that the capitalist system relies on. And like the capitalist system, the nation-state system is therefore susceptible to periodic crises and a lot of change. It is not a system that remains static. One of the very crucial purposes of this system is spatial organization. It is to concentrate things like poverty, war, and ecological degradation in some parts of the world, and wealth and peace and substantial legal rights, as well as other forms of kind of, let's call it elite living in other parts of the world, and to keep those things separate. So one of its roles is essentially to prevent movement. And I think this is something that in the heartlands of the nation-state system is not apparent, that the nation-state system exists to stop people moving. But for many people in the world, that is the reality of the nation-state system. It is a grid that stops them from entering other parts of the world. And for that reason, because climate change is also in the background of the book, the nation-state system is fighting greater and greater forces of human migration, which are very threatening to it. Now, until quite recently, people in rich countries had very little to complain about. The system was set up for them. It was set up to shield people in rich countries from a lot of the costs and fallout of capitalism. But in recent years, because of changes in the sort of labor structure particularly, an increasing number of people in rich countries are also falling victim to the violence of the nation-state system and are being increasingly sort of expelled, to use a Saskia Sassen word, from the benefits that have previously accrued to them simply on the basis of their nationality. So if you go back to about 1800, it was much more important what class you were from than what nation you were from. So wealthy people in Africa or Asia were pretty much as wealthy people in Europe or America. And what happened from about 1820 onwards was a massive divergence of global experience, such that by the end, being poor in the United States or Britain was much better than being middle class or even wealthy in Africa and bits of Asia. And so your nationality became much more important than your class. Now we're having a movement back in the other direction, where increasingly class matters more than nationality. And I think, this is a long answer to your question, but to get back to what you asked, what is happening, nation states are becoming less and less reliable as guarantors of the sort of legal rights, economic securities, and indeed even social liberties that people in rich countries have become used to over several decades. And how that plays out, I think it varies from country to country, but all of you are aware that a lot of different mechanisms are being prepared right now in the United States that can be activated to deprive people more and more of their democratic freedoms and even their liberties. So I don't think the nation-state system is ceasing to exist. It is not disappearing. If anything, it's the reverse. States are becoming sterner, more entrenched, and their relationship to their populations is becoming more embattled. And I think it's very crucial in all this for us to understand that states are not peoples. Nietzsche has this beautiful thing where he says that the state is a cold monster that tells a great lie. It says, I am the people. And Americans are more prone to that lie than pretty much anyone else, because the sort of Declaration of Independence says, we the people. But if you look at, my book tries to take a long, multi-century view of states. If you look at that long history, you realize that the interests of states and the interests of people sort of converge and diverge over time. And we can talk about why that might be the case, but I think the period of great convergence between state interests and people's interests, there are a lot of interesting reasons why that happened in the 20th century. I think we're seeing that divergence right now, and we're seeing people being more and more bewildered by what their states are doing to them and in the rest of the world.
Yeah, I mean, you write near the end of the book, you say that the system of nation states is mutating such that it is unable to deliver to human beings the once promised rights, freedoms, and securities. And I want to talk about why that happened, but also about this sort of history. In other words, why states, at least in the West, kind of converged with peoples to some degree, and then why that changed. But before I ask you that, I think one thing that probably a lot of people think when they hear after nations or this idea of the sort of the crisis of the nation state is that in some ways, we're seeing it feels like we are seeing a real resurgence of nationalisms, at least.
Yeah.
Certainly, and of an attempt to construct a kind of national capitalism. I mean, you can certainly see that here in the U.S. I mean, it's obviously a kind of maybe more accurately described as a Trumpian capitalism, but there is this rhetorical idea, at least, and certainly in the UK with Brexit and the rest. And so, what's the confluence of those two things? The kind of weakening of the nation state's ability, or maybe it's indifference to deliver the goods, and then this rise of nationalism. I mean, is the latter, I guess, just a response to the former?
Well, I think that, again, we're coming up against different. We speak about America as if it had a unified objective interest,
Yeah.
but in fact, we are now seeing a very factionalized political space where there are different interests. And certain very, very powerful interests may be set against, or may see that their own path to success is incompatible with the political setup that exists today. So I think, one of the key, my book tells 4 long stories. One is called God, and it's a theological history of France. The second one is called Money, and it's a financial history of Britain. The third is called Law, and it's a legal history of the American Empire. And the fourth is called Nature, and it's an ecological history of China. And it's 500 pages long, and I could talk for days about it, but I will just sort of isolate one argument, which is, in answer to James's question, that in our understanding of the history of democracy, we speak as if democracy flowed simply from some nice ideas that philosophers came up with that people thought would be very cool, and were therefore implemented. Actually, if you look at the gap between the formulation of those ideas and their implementation, in Britain, say, which is the country I focus on in the Money chapter, that gap is at least 150 years. It wasn't that these ideas were published and then everyone thought, what a great thing to do. The reason that democracy at one point became viable, indeed desirable, or even essential for the nation state, is because of industrial labor. That while Britain was essentially making its money overseas through colonial projects, and the British population had almost no interaction with what the East India Company was doing, etc. The British population was a problem for this money-making project. It was a problem for the British state, which was highly invested in these massive, massive trading companies. And so the British population had to be kept out of the electoral system. And the British population, we remember the slavery, the colonialism of 18th century Britain, but it is also true that the British state was terrifying to the British people also. The level of incarceration, the level of punishment, the level of predation of young men who were kidnapped and sent over to the Caribbean to die of malaria, policing slave plantations, the number of women who left villages that have been enclosed and became prostitutes in London because essentially the peasant economy had been suddenly destroyed. It was a very terrifying place to be, and those people turned to crime often to try and lay their hands on liquid currency, and their hands were cut off, they were hanged, they were burnt to try and sort of control them. And what changed was industrialization. The fact that Britain developed this extraordinary, world-changing industrial monopoly which sucked in an immense amount of the British poor, turned them into working classes, to the point that the British majority became strategically crucial to the British project. And at that point, their bargaining, their political demands could no longer be ignored. And you see throughout the 19th century greater and greater concessions were reluctantly made to give political rights, to give a share in the profits of colonialism and in the industrial complex, and ultimately to start investing in a welfare state that would pay for the healthcare, the old age, the unemployment of the population. we now think that that's the purpose of the nation state, that it always existed for that purpose. But it existed for that purpose over a period of time when Western countries had this incredible monopoly over the industrial complex. Today they don't.
Can I?
Yes.
So one of the things that's interesting is your argument is, you sort of talk, you frame it in terms of this shift, I think, from the principle of property to the principle of labor, essentially, right? Work becomes essential for creating wealth in a way that it was not in the 18th century, right? So in the 18th century, East India Company is making money primarily abroad and through commodities, et cetera, but then you see this shift with industrialization. And so your argument is it's not that the working classes or the people were sort of causing more trouble necessarily. It's that they were actually became essential to the operation of the economy and
absolutely.
Of the state.
They were causing an immense amount of trouble in the 18th century.
Yeah.
The news of the French Revolution electrified the British masses. They said, these are our rights. And there were reasons for the British to actually claim, since the Magna Carta, certain kinds of privileges as Englishmen. We Englishmen. This was a constant platform for political and legal claims. Those claims were brutally repressed in the 18th century. People were sent to Australia. So they weren't making more trouble in the 19th century. In fact, a lot of their protests were much more peaceful because they were much more confident of their position in the 19th century. The Chartists, for instance, they had peaceful assemblies in whichever common it was in London in 1848. No, it was not that they were fighting harder. It was that they were critical to the imperial project.
Right.
And so James invokes these phrases I use, the principle of property, which is the 18th century principle where joint stock companies, land, and other valuable goods were the preserve of the rich. The poor didn't really have any access to those. They were not shareholders in these big trading firms. And so there were essentially two entirely separate economies. And the principle of property was a world-changing principle. These were not sort of, unimaginative, backward-looking people. They were the world-changing radical capitalist class that did everything we know, including in this country. The principle of property becomes replaced by a much more powerful principle of labor in the 19th century, where the most powerful and dazzling product of the Industrial Revolution is the working class, which is not simply a force, a labor force, but also an intellectual force, a cultural force, a political force. Now, if we come to today, one of the most extraordinary things about Silicon Valley is its assault, which is absolutely consistent in every part of its activities, on the principle of labor. It is undermining labor in every way possible, symbolically and actually. And in the context of my argument, that is not simply an economic battle. It is not that we want to extract more profit from the system, though that, of course, is important. It is that if you take away the political significance of labor, the strategic significance of labor, you are then able to take away other things. And
if you take away the economic significance of labor, right? If labor stops mattering as much to the to the state, the operations of the economy,
to the entire power complex. I mean, one of the big arguments is that Silicon Valley is absolutely of the utmost strategic significance to the American state. Everything that the American state is relying on to remain ahead of China, to keep the dollar as the global currency, is dependent on Silicon Valley's continued competitive lead. And therefore, Silicon Valley can get a lot of concessions from the state. And so what Silicon Valley does to labor becomes part of the kind of entire political makeup of the United States. Starting from the fact, it's not just the fact that Silicon Valley is starting from the outsourcing of labor to Asia, going through the sort of automation of labor in all kinds of ways, but also simply the training not only of Americans but of people around the world training people to understand that their labor is not valuable. Even Facebook, Facebook, its entire market valuation of whatever 1 trillion, whatever it is, dollars, is not based on the relatively trivial architecture that took only a few 100,000 man-hours to build. It is based on the data that is provided by users. That is the labor, the billions of hours of labor that has gone into making that valuable.
All unpaid.
Yes, so impressing upon people that you give this and we take it and we don't pay you for it, it's not simply an economic project. It is a way of rewiring our relationship to our leisure, our time, our labor, and all that sort of thing. And so I think a lot of what is following on, I mean, Donald Trump comes in as a sort of, a guy who has the right characteristics, essentially, to break apart a lot of these things that are already being broken, but ultimately you have to also break the political and legal framework, and he is just very useful in that respect, but he is not the author of all this. That is part of a much greater epochal sort of transition that is happening in the United States right now, and it has a lot to do with China as well.
Let me, I have so many questions to ask, but let me, I want to ask you about Trump specifically, but before I do that, let me sort of challenge one, or just ask you to engage with one aspect of this, which is the US economy, the unemployment rate is 4.2%, the employment to population ratio for prime age people is about as high as it's been in the past 20 years. It's lower than it was in the 90s, but it's relatively high, around 80%. So over the last, really since Trump was elected, with the exception of the little COVID blip, we've actually seen real wages for production and supervisory and non-supervisory workers rise for the first time, really in 20 years, maybe more. So that doesn't quite seem to fit with this idea that work is being replaced, or with this idea that, so how do we make sense of that? How do we make sense of that happening at the same time as Silicon Valley is kind of, in your model, sort of becoming a little bit of these Google, Facebook are kind of the East India companies of today. Yeah. That's maybe an overstatement, but something along those lines.
Yeah. Well, I think that of course, certain forms of labor will have more value in the new labor organization that is going to arise. I guess some industrial production will come back to the United States because, A, because it might become strategically necessary, and B, because the cost of American labor might fall.
Yeah.
But I think that
And Trump is blackmailing companies to get them to do that.
Yes. I don't know how much he can do that, because I think that China is sewing up a lot of the sort of distribution systems of industrial inputs, and Asian labor is more efficient and cheaper.
Yeah.
So I think there are limits to how far that can go. But I think that the key things that are happening are the ways in which the middle classes are going to be held to ransom over their labor. Because I think intellectual labor is going to be subjected to pressures that even industrial labor, because the middle classes in the West, these are the people that have the greatest allegiance to the state and to the nation-state system. In fact, they are the theoreticians and the greatest diplomats for that system. Yeah. And they are the people who are at greatest risk right now. And they have also extracted the greatest benefits from this system. Their labor is way, way overpriced compared to their classes in other countries. And I think, once again, outsourcing was never only about money. It was about sidestepping a lot of the privileges that had accrued to Western labor. So you didn't just move a job from California or Texas or Minnesota to Shenzhen. You stripped that job on the way of lots of its legal and financial coating, right, and you put down something very different in Shenzhen. So the sort of whole movement of labor around the world is about trying to sidestep the pretensions that labor acquired in the 20th century.
That's a good word for it. It's interesting.
The excessive claims that it acquired. And that battle, I think, is going to play out very heavily with AI in the coming years.
Yeah, so I wanted to, obviously AI feels like is one of the, if not the, maybe the primary tool by which this assault is going to take place. But when you started writing the book, I presume AI was not as much on your mind because the big leap has happened only in the last, I don't know, let's say 2 or 3 years, really.
Yeah.
Did that argument about the kind of devaluation or whatever we want to call it of, or the shrinking of the pretensions, the stripping of the pretensions, did that argument change substantively for you, or do you see AI as simply a kind of accelerant of what was already occurring?
Well, I think when I started writing the book, I mean, it was only 3 or 4 years after Thomas Piketty's Capital came out.
Right.
We were already in a big conversation about inequality, and certainly, well, Trump's first election and certainly Brexit were part of that.
Yeah.
I mean, inequality in the UK is quite astonishing. And you don't need AI to realize that the financial revolution and the reorganization of global production that's been going on since the late 70s has concentrated wealth within rich countries enormously. And that process was already far advanced in the time. I mean, there's a lot of stuff in the book also about the incredible changes that have happened in banking and shadow banking, hedge funds, private equity, and the ways in which, indeed, there is a very 18th century feel to our reality today, that small groups of people are able to monopolize the gains, the profits of the economy, but also to impose more and more taxes on, I mean, I don't mean taxes in the kind of literal sense, but, you know, to the extent that private equity firms are controlling more and more of the kind of visible reality of ordinary consumers, they're in a position to, let's say in healthcare, to stifle competition, to shut down free or cheap options, and to basically force everyone into their own sort of, to be paying them for services, to the extent that the cost of living and the amount that these people can extract from society is vastly magnified. So inequality has been going on for a long time, and the extent to which the bottom 50% of Western nations are strategically important to the global economy, that has been going down for a long time. A lot of what has been happening in sort of far-right politics in Europe is to do with the misery of realizing that you, a middle-class Hungarian, Italian, Spaniard, whatever, are now face-to-face in direct competition with Asian labor that you cannot compete with, that your place is, you are one of the people whose fortunes are dropping the fastest in the global economy, and you're terrified, and you turn to leaders who promise to protect you, insulate the nation state, cut off globalization, shut off all the immigration, all that sort of thing, and provide you with symbolic, I mean, this is another thing that one of the responses to this, because the nation state cannot do most of the things it promises to do in these situations, so it compensates populations with symbolic alternatives. We can't put any more money in your pocket, but we can turn you against those guys and make you feel better than them, make you feel better than those foreigners, those people of a different ethnicity, etc. And that's what has happened in a lot of countries. And it's a lot of these things that turned me on to this subject, that I felt the nation state was becoming extremely hysterical, and the political conversation was not a real conversation, it was a deflected conversation from the things that were actually
from the actual things that people were.
Yeah.
Well, no, I mean, the inequality thing is interesting because you can even see it sort of within, you can certainly see it obviously within kind of, let's say, the consumer market. I mean, there's this study that was just done that said that essentially 48% of all retail spending in the United States is done by the top 10%
Right.
of the income spectrum, which I mean, it's fascinating to think about in terms of the dependence and the essential, and which in turn, of course, makes the economy more dependent on the top 10% since they're the ones that are driving it. But even if you think about inequality within the corporate sector, right? So you have these relatively small number of firms which are earning these crazy super profits, and this year it hasn't been quite that extreme. But for 2 or 3 years, most of the gains in the S&P 500 were driven by essentially 7 companies, basically. Yeah. And that wasn't a bubble. It was actually that they were in fact earning these crazy super profits that other things are. But so the country what we haven't talked about, and I mean you mentioned it, but I have not asked you about it. But it feels like is the shadow and in some ways was the driver behind some of the shift that you're talking about, beginning in the 70s and 80s, is of course China. So how does China fit into your story? What role did it play, and how does it as a nation state fit into the story?
Is China a nation state?
Yeah, it's a great question.
That's
right.
Another question.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's about 150 pages devoted to China. But I think one of the arguments about China is that I argue that it is no coincidence that the high point of Western liberalism coincided with China's complete absence from the global economy. Right. That during the years, let's say 1949 to the 70s, China essentially exerted no force on the global economy, and India also exerted very little force on the global economy. And this was, for very complicated reasons, an extraordinary windfall for the West, because Europe had spent the previous 7 or 8 centuries essentially working out how to pay Asia. And while it was trying to pay Asia, it was unable to really invest in domestic institutions. It was always trying to extract more money to export silver to pay China. And there were a whole series of European superpowers going back to Genoa and Venice, through Amsterdam, through finally to London, that were constantly saddled by this problem of how could you sort of mine enough, enslave enough, whatever, to pay China. How could you ever find enough?
They were paying China. Why were they paying? They had to pay China for?
Because Europe was always, the European superpowers were always dealing in Oriental goods.
Right.
With Asian luxury goods, which became Asian staples like tea. Indian textiles, and usually Europe had nothing to offer Asia because Europe didn't produce anything that Asia wanted. So Europe always had to pay India and China in gold and silver, and a lot of slavery happened for that reason. Britain was the last superpower that inherited this problem, and it dealt with it by destroying India and China. And once India and China were destroyed as global forces, and they had, let's remember, in the 18th century, those two countries accounted for 50% of global GDP until, let's say, 1780s. I mean, that's extraordinary, 50% of global GDP. Once they ceased to exist, European countries, and then the United States, but especially European countries, could internalize their profits and start investing in their own populations and their own institutions. But the return of China, China again seeking to have influence over global currency systems, China again being the center of global production, China again being not exactly a nation state, an imperial formation that is sort of consuming a lot of the national architectures of Africa, Central Asia, and much of the rest of Asia. This really challenges the American system in very profound ways. It challenges the dollar, it challenges the cellular system on which American capitalism has been built, and it takes away the sort of industrial raison d'etre of the West. It brings that to an end. So where is the West left? Well, Europe's not left in a very good place at all, but America has Silicon Valley. And Silicon Valley is one of the things that is still keeping America just in a position that it can continue to dictate the global currency system and trading system. In the Yale review piece, I sort of quote the fact that, as everyone at Ivy League universities will be aware, the US government was until very recently the world's largest funder of scientific research. And a lot of the buildings and patents and achievements of a university like this are built on that state funding. Today, I think it's Facebook,
Amazon, Google. I don't know.
Four of them.
Actually, I think if you toss in NVIDIA, it's probably even more.
Four of them exceed the expenditure of the American state.
The entire United States, of the entire U.S. government.
Of the entire U.S. government. Four of them exceed the expenditure of the entire U.S. government. And if you take corporate research as a whole, it dwarfs what the US government has done. So basically, scientific advance is in the hands of private corporations. And so it's no surprise that those corporations are always in Washington. They are more and more essential to, and therefore given power over, the political system.
I mean, so that idea of the state as kind of the handmaiden of corporations, or the bourgeoisie, is obviously goes back to Marx. But it does feel like one of the arguments you make at the end, and this again is one of the things that harkens back to the 18th century, is that we're witnessing, maybe we were already in, or maybe in the process of these corporations becoming, in effect, more powerful, or at least a counterpower to the state. And I mean, can you talk a little bit about how you conceive of, or how we should conceive of, the relationship between these Silicon Valley giants and the U.S. state?
I'm actually finding it's very exciting to talk about my book. I'm enjoying myself a lot. So I think, as people in law and finance would be aware, the nature of the corporation has changed a lot. So yes, in the 18th century, you had these sort of trading monopolies. The East India Company is the most famous, but there were many others in Britain. France had its own, the Dutch had their own. And if you Google the biggest corporation in history, usually the answer that comes up is the Dutch East India Company, which they translate into sort of contemporary terms of $20 trillion or something like that. Those conversions don't mean anything, but these are corporations that have political and they have economic power commensurate with the size of the state itself. And because they are directly financial institutions as opposed to the state, which is many other things, the state increasingly becomes founded as a financial project on these corporations. So the British banking system in the 18th century was completely founded on East India Company stock. 25% of British MPs were shareholders in the East India Company. The East India Company could call in the British Navy at will to defend its interests in India or wherever it might be. It was essentially running the state. And when the East India Company went bankrupt in the 1760s, politicians didn't know what to do, and they had a dilemma. Should we save the state or should we save the corporation? And they saved the corporation. And the result was they lost America, because they asked America essentially to bail out the East India Company, with the results that everybody in this room knows better than me. So that is quite extraordinary. Yeah. I mean, you guys might think that it was a great thing that America became independent, but to British members of parliament in the 1770s, it was a tragedy. It was a complete catastrophe, and yet they were willing to risk that rather than endanger the corporation itself. Now, if we fast forward to the sort of, let's say, call it the classical period of the nation state, or the high period of the nation state after the Second World War, and even a bit before the Second World War, corporations become far better enfolded within the nation state.
That's right.
They are, and this is very much a result of war. The two world wars are moments when all the leading nations basically domesticate their industrial capabilities for the purposes of a war economy. And so the state protects itself enormously against corporate power, antitrust laws, etc. And you find by, let's say the 1960s, that big corporations like AT&T or General Motors, these corporations are magnifying the power, the political and economic power of the American state, and producing incredible circuits, financial circuits within the state of taxation, labor, etc. Silicon Valley is very different. It's much more similar to the East India Company than to General Motors because, A, its scale is much greater. The market capitalization of Microsoft or Facebook compared to General Motors it's enormous.
And even as a percentage of GDP.
And as a percentage of GDP.
Yeah.
But also, these companies are increasingly not nested within the nation state, but rivals to the nation state with rival conceptions of law, finance, labor, etc. So the state might want full employment because the state is rather scared at what would happen if there was sort of 40% unemployment. But it is in partnership with private organizations that have a very different idea of what the future might hold or how profits might be derived. And that conflict is sort of where we all are right now. We're in the midst of that sort of conflict between states that are mortgaged to Silicon Valley, but also deeply scared of the sort of consequences of what Silicon Valley might do.
We're going to take questions for about 10 minutes. So if you have questions, does someone have a mic? Can you? But as you do that, I mean, and the other difference which you write about in the book is obviously also the relationship of these companies to labor in the sense that General Motors employed, I don't know what it was, like 800,000 workers at its peak or something, and these workers these companies, with the exception of Amazon, just simply they don't even have to. It's not even that they're sinisterly deciding not to. Their businesses, they're able to reap enormous profits with relatively low numbers of workers.
Yeah, the digitalization of the U.S. economy produced all kinds of extraordinary opportunities to divorce the economy from the population at large.
Yeah.
And yes, they have all been incredibly canny, not only at keeping their workforces down, but of course outsourcing, intellectual property, making sure they don't pay taxes,
right,
and basically insulating themselves from the state. Should we take questions?
Yeah, let's take questions.
Could you talk about the implications of cryptocurrency in all of what you're discussing?
So I think cryptocurrency is something that's it's aligned with several different factions in this sort of. So on the one hand, of course, people like Elon Musk and Donald Trump are deeply invested in that world. But I think most sort of crypto people themselves would not like to have anything to do with either Musk or Trump because theirs is a kind of fundamentally libertarian sort of conception where the state cannot be trusted to be the custodian of currency. Currencies that are run by nation states are basically devaluing all the time. And of course, there's a basket of currencies that, and the US dollar is obviously one, which are relatively stable. But if you look at the sort of 100 or so currencies in the world, most of them are not stable at all. And most people who labor in exchange for those currencies are in crisis. And many of them hoard dollars or hoard euros or whatever it might be in order to insulate themselves against the volatility. So crypto people say, this is a terrible system. States cannot be trusted. The only thing that can be trusted is mathematics. And we should build scarce currencies that are founded in mathematics that have nothing to do with states. So I think crypto will play lots of different kinds of role in this. I mean, I think a lot of people are jumping to and will jump to crypto as volatility increases in the dollar system. We're fond of saying that Bitcoin has appreciated, let's say, I don't know, 10 times since 2020. But you could also say that the dollar has depreciated by 90% against Bitcoin in the same period. So that's how Bitcoin people see it, that they are up against a sort of currency crisis, and they are the shelter from that crisis. But as you know, people are building all kinds of political concepts on the back of crypto. So people are probably aware of the work of Balaji Srinivasan, who's a crypto guy, a Silicon Valley billionaire, who basically says our politics should be like our crypto wallet. We should be able to kind of move around. Our nationality should be like that. And basically, we should all be our own state. And he is a friend of Peter Thiel's. He's a guy who basically openly says that democracy is terrible, and stupid people or people with no resources shouldn't anyway there's no point even thinking about them. We should live in a world of the strong and the powerful and let them innovate and all that. So crypto is a very ambiguous, weird energy in all this. I think that possibly a lot of systems could be stabilized by crypto over the coming years, because I see a lot of volatility in money markets. But I think also crypto is something that will very quickly drain energies away from the nation-state system in ways that are not very productive for any of us. That will once again benefit the wealthy and not really build anything in the place of the state. Yeah, there's more to say, but...
Other question?
Hi, thank you so much. This is fascinating. I wanted to ask about your nature section. There's this moment in the US this summer, which I'm still not over, where I think it was 6 senators wrote a letter to Canada saying, hey, your wildfire smoke is hitting us, stop it. And I was just thinking about what also is pan-national and the effects of, I think, this warmer, stormier, burning world just moves on its own accord. So I'd love to hear what you were thinking about climate change, what you're thinking about now. In terms of that.
Yeah, I mean, one obvious thing to say is that we are going through the decline and even death of liberalism. And as a response to all these other changes that are happening, liberalism is less and less credible to more and more people. And the anti-liberal or illiberal governments that are being elected are not very interested in sort of international treaties and conventions on nuclear weapons, on global warming, on war. And so we're also entering a world that's less and less able to sort of cooperate over some of these issues, which is, terrible. Two things I'd say. One is that, this is what we were discussing yesterday, that China as a kind of transnational tribute system is going to be, I think, or already is, much more efficient than the United States at extracting natural resources, timber, rare earth metals, steel, copper, cobalt, whatever it might be, from the earth, and feeding it into an integrated industrial system. We have the Belt and Road Initiative, but we also have the immense penetration of zones which American corporations have failed to penetrate in the past. So I think the Chinese era brings us much more quickly towards sort of ecological limits than we would have had in a cellular nation-state sort of organization. And the other thing I would say is is an advertisement for a session I'm doing tomorrow with my partner Mariam, who's an expert on the global countryside, where we're talking about farming. Mariam is the expert here. I'm a sort of hanger-on. But with her, I've traveled to a lot of fields in Asia, Latin America, Africa over the last few years. And climate change is not abstract. It is not something that's happening sort of in scientific reports and numbers. It's happening on the ground. And farmers who have had centuries of sort of knowing that on June 1st, the rain comes and we plant, can no longer tell when that rain is going to come, if it's going to come torrentially, and therefore their ability to sort of continue doing what they did is completely thrown apart. And one of the obvious and already happening crises that is resulting from that is people leaving the land. And I think climate change will hit us as a global political system first as a migration problem. I mean, it already hits us as a terrorism problem because a lot of people have to join various kinds of militias or whatever to make a living. But migration is going to be something that our politics has to figure out a way to deal with human movement on a large scale, I think.
One more question, if there's one. Okay.
You implied that China might not be a nation state. Could you elaborate on that? Whether China is a nation state?
Where's the speaker?
Right there.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, this is, so I think it's important to remember that until, in 1900 there were about 50 nation states, things that we could call sovereign nations. Now the UN has 193 seats. And it is the United States that has presided over that expansion. It is the United States. The Soviet Union played a role too, but it is the United States more than any other power that decided this is the model for global organization. We're going to divide the world into sovereign powers that are going to be legally equivalent, and they're going to trade amongst each other. And this was a system that America was already familiar with from its dealings in Latin America. And we, America, will coerce those nation states to ensure that property rights are guaranteed, all that kind of stuff. Now, the United States, whatever else we think, the United States has done a lot to oppress and destroy many of those countries, but it has also put in a lot of investment to keep this system afloat, because a lot of those things were not actually viable units, and even their early governments knew they weren't viable units. They couldn't pay for anything, they didn't have any trained graduates in their populations, they had no military or industrial resources. They would collapse were it not for the superpowers that invested in them, that gave them expertise, technological transfers, military and industrial investments and all that sort of thing. And the United States today continues, under its various treaties, its military budgets, to pour in money to just make sure that a lot of these states can hold together. And it's not just Sudan or Somalia, it's also Poland. These guys are getting a lot of training and everything from the United States to make sure that they can continue to meet the minimal qualifications as states, the monopoly over violence. Now, China doesn't have that interest at all. China has almost zero investment in those kinds of things. And that is part of China's appeal. China says, we're not interested in your ideologies, your political institutions. You do that as you wish. We are simply here to trade with you. But I think China will not... China's approach is through barter, agreements over bartering. We'll give you this, and you give us this. You can borrow from us. And one of the consequences, in a lot of cases, Sri Lanka is one I write about in the book, is a sort of gradual indebtedness of these countries such that they sort of start falling apart financially. But the resulting turmoil, political and social turmoil, these states are not necessarily equipped to deal with because China is not standing guarantor to the political system or let's say, the coercive systems of those countries. That's nothing to do with China. So a Chinese era, I suspect, will see a lot more collapses of national authority, and into the kind of ensuing void, China itself will come and govern a lot of forces, but there will also be a lot of non-state actors that will flourish in those kinds of scenarios. So China, with its long history as an empire which considered itself to cover all under heaven, and to embrace all of humanity, China as a country that welcomed embassies from tribute countries which were also part of their own polity, I think that is being rolled out again and again. You see it in the food systems that are centered on China. So much of the world is being turned into an agricultural hinterland for China to feed Chinese people. So I think the concern with maintaining an independent Somalian state that has these characteristics, a head of state, a government, a national bank, I suspect that there will be lots of implosions of those kinds of peripheral states over the coming years, and that we will have a world ruled much more by regional powers, which, I mean, we're already seeing it, but I think that's going to be more the case when America ceases to be able to essentially prop up the 193 UN seats.
All right. Thank you very much. That's all we have time for. This is great.
Thank you.
Thanks.